What is your favorite video game? Maybe it is something from your childhood that brings back warm memories. Or perhaps it's a modern game you love diving into every evening after work. Or it might be a game with an unforgettable story. Or a really challenging experience you finally overcame. Well, I'm sure everyone has their own choice, even if it is just solitaire. Have you ever argued with someone about which game is the best? And have you ever managed to convince someone else that your choice is right? Personally, I haven't. How can you even compare them? Just in this season alone, we've already talked about several significant titles that influence the entire gaming industry. But what if I told you there is one video game that is considered the absolute best? You've probably already looked at the episode title and know which game I'm talking about. It's The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. According to the website Metacritic, it has a score of 99 out of 100. For example, Baldur's Gate 3 from our previous episode has a score of 96 out of 100 and is ranked 21st. Half-Life 2 also had a score of 96 and is ranked 16th. In this episode, we will explore what is fascinating about the Legend of Zelda series, how it was created, and why it remains one of the most important game series in the history. Hi there and welcome to the Released podcast. Today technology surrounds us everywhere, and we can't even imagine our lives without it. But every technology started as a bold idea in someone's head. In this podcast, we talk about the technologies that have changed our lives and the people who invented them. My name is Rival. Hi. Did you enjoy exploring the world around you when you were a child? Did you imagine yourself as a discoverer or a pioneer? Were you excited by your unexpected findings? What is behind that hill? If you swim to that island in the middle of the lake, what is waiting there? And if I climb this tall tree, what will I see from up there? Sometimes, even now, I can't resist exploring new places. You go out just to buy some bread and suddenly, oh, that is an interesting street. I never noticed it before. And what is around that corner? And before you know it, you return home a couple of hours later, forgetting about bread. The first game in the Legend of Zelda series was developed in the mid-80s. Shigeru Miyamoto, the game's designer, recalled that as a child he once found a small cave in a bamboo grove near a temple. Another time he stumbled upon a lake at the top of a mountain. He wanted to capture in a video game this feeling, the excitement of exploring the world and making unexpected discoveries. The creators aimed to make the game feel like a fairy tale adventure. They were inspired, for instance, by the Lord of the Rings books.
そうですね。その頃やっぱり8ビットなので、壮大な世界を描きたくても絵はそんなに描けないんですよね。そうすると。
Well, so of course back in the 8-bit days, because it was so simple, you couldn't draw, detailed graphics, and particularly for Zelda, it was very simple tiles that we were using, and so in wanting to create an adventure game, the first thing I thought was, well, how can I create the graphics in a way that anyone can understand? And the first thing that I did was I went back to my own experiences of exploring the mountains and coming across lakes. And I thought, well, maybe if what I can do is draw sort of simplified representations of things that I've experienced myself, then perhaps people playing can see those simplified representations and they can connect to them through their own experiences and recognize them for what they represent in the game. And so it's a little bit of using the limited graphics coupled with your own imagination to help you, the player, paint the full picture of the world.
That is Shigeru Miyamoto recalling how the game was created. The first game was released in 1986 for the Nintendo Entertainment System console. Remember, I mentioned this console in the first episode of the podcast, when we discussed the history of the Sony PlayStation. In fact, there is an Easter egg in that episode that connects it to this one about Zelda. See if you can find it. The first Legend of Zelda game was quite unusual for gamers at that time. Not long before its release, Super Mario Bros. Came out. By the way, Mario was created by the same developers who made Zelda, and they intentionally tried to make these two games as different from each other as possible. You are probably familiar with Mario games, but I'll briefly describe it anyway. In Mario, you see your character from the side, always moving from left to right. Players don't have much freedom. These types of games are called side-scrollers. In Zelda, however, the character appeared in the middle of a small meadow, viewed from above. Players were offered the freedom to go wherever they wanted. Nearby there was a small cave. If you entered it, you'd receive a sword. But this concept was so unusual at the time, some players didn't even find the sword. Out of habit, they just walked to the right, encountered monsters and died. Mario moved linearly from point A to point B, but in Zelda, players had to think carefully about their next step and direction. The game didn't limit or prompt you. There were no clear instructions or paths to follow. Instead, the world was full of secret places that could only be discovered through careful exploration. For example, you could take a candle and burn certain trees to reveal hidden passages. There were several dungeons in the game, each containing puzzles and rewards for solving them. Many critics consider Zelda one of the first true open-world games. In Zelda, it's the player, not the character, who gains experience by exploring the world through the hero. In short, the main character, Link, rescues Princess Zelda from the evil demon Ganon. All these events take place in a small kingdom called Hyrule. Generally speaking, this is pretty much the plot of almost every game in the series. The games are connected, in a way. Each game has its own Link and Zelda, but they are not always the same characters as you might think. Instead, there are different heroes from different eras and universes. It can get pretty confusing, but I won't go into too much detail here. The main idea is always similar. Link has to save Zelda. The original game came with a beautiful illustrated book that explains the world's history and taught some game mechanics. Why don't modern games come with beautiful books full of illustrations anymore? Another interesting detail is that the main character doesn't speak any words. Even in modern Zelda games, where the other main characters have voices, Link still remains silent. This helps players better associate themselves with the hero. We've already discussed this approach in some of the previous episodes. The open world introduced a few more new features. For example, you could save your progress to avoid losing your achievements. Special cartridges were used for this. On the other hand, there were no leaderboards or points awarded at the end of the game. The game was a huge success, selling 1 million copies on its very first day. Its impact on the gaming industry was massive, and today many games use the concepts of open worlds and hidden secrets pioneered by Zelda. In the next game in the series, Nintendo experimented with gameplay, introducing side-scrolling elements. When players entered dungeons, the view changed to a side perspective, making the game look somewhat similar to Mario. But not all players liked these changes. Today there are about 20 games in the series. I'm not going to cover all of them, just a few. Let's jump to the year 1998. This was the year when The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was released. The very game from the beginning of the episode, often called the greatest game ever made. The game was released for the Nintendo 64 console. Let me remind you, at that time, Nintendo continued to use cartridges unlike its competitors, such as Sony PlayStation, which had already started using CDs. CDs could store about 20 times more data than cartridges. On the other hand, thanks largely to the PlayStation, 3D games were becoming widespread, and Zelda was no exception. Ocarina of Time became the first 3D game in the series. Developers faced a difficult challenge, fitting an entire three-dimensional game, along with many cutscenes, small cinematic videos, into just 32 megabytes of memory. At the time, 3D games were still quite new, and there were no established methods or techniques yet. Developers had to experiment and invent new mechanics. One of these was the fairy named Navi, who became a companion to the main character. Navi helped to grab the player's attention, explain new mechanics, introduce parts of the storyline, and even assist players in navigating the 3D world. The combat system was closely connected to Navi too. For example, during battles, Navi would circle over an enemy, allowing Link to fix his eyes on the target. A similar mechanic is used today in games like Dark Souls. This solved many problems of combat in a three-dimensional space. Developers succeeded in creating an interesting map filled with different locations. Players could ride a horse to move around faster. The main storyline and additional quests complemented each other nicely. Also, according to the story, the player could travel through time and play either as a young or adult Link. Each version of Link had different abilities and gameplay. The game's storyline was pretty advanced for its time and was revealed gradually through cutscenes, a rarity back then. The music in the game deserves special attention as well. Each area of Hyrule has its own unique musical theme. Sometimes the soundtrack includes melodies the player learns during the game for playing on the ocarina. Some players even describe the game as feeling like a musical. That is how important the music was. Players truly loved the game. Some people bought a Nintendo 64 console specifically to play it. Actually, that is Nintendo's well-known tactic, releasing great games exclusively for their own consoles, boosting console sales. Speaking about its popularity, it's even said that the game increased the sales of ocarinas. I mean the real musical instrument itself. After the game's release, many people wanted to learn how to play an ocarina. Ocarina of Time also had a big influence on future games. Even the creators of Grand Theft Auto once said that the world of Zelda inspired them when designing their own open worlds. It's surprising to think that a crime action game took inspiration from a fairy tale-like adventure game. And now you might ask, what's the secret? Why exactly does this game have the highest rating on Metacritic? Honestly, I don't know. Yes, it's undoubtedly a great game that is interesting to play, and at its time it introduced many new and revolutionary mechanics. But why is it the best? Like I said before, how can we really compare these games? Just 2 years later, the next game, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, was released. Interestingly, the power of the Nintendo 64 was no longer enough for this game. Players had to buy a special extension to increase the console's RAM from 4 to 8 megabytes. The game became memorable thanks to its story, which was darker and more serious. The main character had to save Hyrule in just 3 days. But it wasn't easy. At the end of those 3 days, Link would travel back in time, reliving the same days again and again. The players had to quickly complete necessary tasks before time ran out. This sense of inevitable doom is what makes Majora's Mask so unusual in the series. In 2006, Nintendo released its new console, the Wii. What made it special were the wireless controllers, which could track the player's movements. You could stand in the middle of your room, swing your controllers, and the game would recognize your actions. For instance, you could play tennis or golf at home, simply by waving your arms. Several Zelda games were released for this console, and of course, the gameplay felt very different. For example, to strike an enemy with your sword, you had to physically swing the controller. Another example was archery, where players aimed by moving the controller. Another neat feature was that some sounds came directly from the controller itself, and the built-in vibration provided tactical feedback. This created a new, more immersive experience for players. It's worth mentioning that the Wii became an incredibly popular console, and Skyward Sword, the Zelda game for this console, is considered of one of the console's best games. Its sales exceeded 3.5 million copies. But gradually, it became clear that the Zelda games needed to be reimagined. In its time, The Legend of Zelda was groundbreaking, but since then, many other great open-world games had come out. Games like The Elder Scrolls Skyrim or The Witcher 3. Zelda, on the other hand, began to focus more on storytelling, becoming smaller, more compact, and more linear. The creators wanted to keep what players loved about Zelda, but drastically rework the gameplay. I should mention that every game in the Zelda series introduced something new, experimenting with different mechanics or ideas. Each of these new features could be quite radical, but the overall balance of familiar and new things was usually maintained. However, with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, the developers decided to take a much more drastic approach. Its subtitle was Breaking Conventions. The team examined every detail of the game and asked themselves, is this really necessary or can we safely remove it? Over 30 years, many details and conventions had accumulated in the series. Some mechanics existed simply because earlier consoles couldn't handle anything else, but modern technology didn't have such limitations, meaning developers could finally create something new. Younger developers came up with fresh, surprising and interesting ideas, offering concepts never seen in Zelda before. Here is how the game's director Hidemaru Fujibayashi recalls it.
当初から変えていこうと、ゼルダの当たり前を変えていこう。
We were thinking about breaking the conventions of the Legend of Zelda series from the very start of the development. Specifically, our process was to think of all kinds of different mechanics and try to distinguish between the unchanging, universal traits of the Zelda franchise and things that had simply become conventions of the series. Some things were decided right from the start, but other decisions come later. We settled on our direction and broad concept first, and then the entire staff got together and considered what to change and what to leave unchanged. The developers even created a small, two-dimensional prototype first, to test various mechanics and ideas before starting the main development. The new game, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, was released in 2017. The game begins with Link running out of a cave onto a small hill. The camera dramatically moves back, showing the player a beautiful, huge open world inviting exploration. Players received a large open world, just like in the original Zelda game, which was exciting to explore. From the very start, players could even head straight to the castle and challenge the final boss. The game doesn't stop you from doing that, although it's very unlikely you'd succeed there. Why limit the player at all? Why not let them climb anywhere they want? Why put invisible walls in the world? In this game, you can climb up really high, look around, and then glide down using your paraglider. Any place on the map can be reached if you put in enough effort. The world itself is so large that it's divided into different regions, each with its own landscape and weather. In the desert, it's hot. In the mountains, it's cold, so you need warm clothes. And when there is a thunderstorm, you'd better remove your metal equipment, or you will get struck by lightning. Though you could throw that equipment at enemies and have the lightning strike them instead. But having such a big open world creates challenges for developers too. It's very hard to tell a coherent story because players might go wherever they want, completing tasks in any order. As I said, a player could go directly to the final boss, or slowly do the tasks of all the locals first. Nothing stops you. And in the end, you and your friend might have completely different adventures in this world. Like in earlier games, Breath of the Wild doesn't explicitly tell you where to go. There are no clear goals or markers. You know how in some games you open them up and see hundreds of icons, events, and tasks, making you feel lost. Zelda doesn't do that. Instead, players explore the world on their own, discovering interesting places by looking from high points or just traveling around. But in such a large world, how do you help players navigate while keeping exploration exciting and enjoyable? As I said, the game developers could simply mark all the points of interest on the map, but that might discourage exploration or turn it into a boring checklist. You need a clear but subtle system. Let's try to imagine ourselves as game designers. We have this problem. How can we solve it? How can we improve player navigation within the game world? To solve this, about 15 huge towers were added across the map. Players could climb these towers and see large parts of the map from above. But how do you guide players between these towers, while still giving a sense of freedom and not forcing them along a single path? Eventually, the developers decided to add numerous small landmarks, such as shrines, tables, and enemy camps. Each place offered something valuable, more health, resources, or items to buy. These landmarks could easily be seen from the towers. For example, smoke rising from camps, or unusual rock formations shaped like skulls, or giant wooden horse statues. The gameplay often went like this. Players climbed a tower, saw several interesting points, and then went exploring. But another problem arose. Too many landmarks visible at once could overwhelm players. To avoid that, the developers placed hills and mountains throughout the landscape to hide certain areas, so the player doesn't have a lot of things in the plain sight. On the other hand, it fuels curiosity to find out what is behind that mountain. As players traveled, they'd gradually discover more new points, periodically distracting from their initial goals. Sometimes it seems that many modern players rely heavily on hints and markers, losing their curiosity and ability to observe and experiment logically. If something works in real life, why not try it in the game? Zelda often rewards such thinking. For example, you can set grass on fire, creating an updraft that lifts you into the air with your paraglider. Or drop a lamp into explosive barrels near enemies. Small details are often amazing. If you are standing on a bridge railing, a passing guard might even tell you not to jump. Many players also loved the visual style of the game. It felt like playing in an anime. Once again, the game was so successful that many people bought a Nintendo Switch specifically to play it. 6 years later, the next game, Tears of the Kingdom, was released. It kept the map from the Breath of the Wild and continued the story several years later. Some gamers even called it more like a DLC rather than a completely new game. However, gameplay-wise, it introduced major changes. The world became much bigger, with the new sky islands and underground dungeons, and the map itself became richer with activities. Now, as you traveled, you constantly encountered new and interesting things. The developers said that while Breath of the Wild was about exploration, the new game focused more on experimentation. Link gained the ability to build various machines and devices by combining different parts. Many players on social media even started competition to create the most original inventions. Link also had to craft weapons and shields from available materials, experimenting and hoping to get something practical. That is the story of the Legend of Zelda series, a series that truly left its mark and shaped how modern open-world games look today. Recently, a movie based on Zelda series was announced, which could further boost the series' popularity, depending, of course, on how well they make it. So, what is it about The Legend of Zelda that players love so much? As with all the games we've talked about so far, it's hard to say exactly. Maybe it is because the series continues to evolve and reinvent itself. Although the core concept and spirit of the game remain the same, each new installment brings something fresh, new mechanics, new features, new gameplay. The developers aren't afraid to experiment, sometimes even starting from scratch. At the same time, they carefully respect the legacy of the series and constantly strive to make it better. Or maybe it is because deep inside many of us, even as adults, there is still that childhood desire to explore, to discover new things and to make surprising discoveries. Perhaps that is why we are always excited to return to this world, wondering what is waiting for us around the next corner. This was the Released podcast, and its first season about video games. Thank you so much for listening. It means a lot to me. I would really appreciate it if you rate the podcast on the platform you are listening on and recommend the podcast to your friends. Thank you, and see you in the next one.